All right, our first presenter in the session today will be Dr. David Karlen. He is the Chief Environmental Scientist at the Hillsborough County Environmental Protection Commission in Tampa, and he'll be presenting about soft sediment benthic communities of Tampa Bay.
Hi, good morning. As you said, my name's Dave Karlen. I'm with the Environmental Protection Commission of Hillsborough County. And I also want to acknowledge all my co-authors on this presentation who work with me at the Benthic monitoring program at EPC. Next slide. What I'm going to present today is the first 25 years of our benthic monitoring program. Next. It's a Bay-wide benthic monitoring program. It's been in place since 1993. And it's we do the sampling in collaboration with Pinellas and Manatee counties. And we employ a stratified random sampling design. The bay is stratified into 7 bay segments, and then we do random samples within each of those strata every year, usually in the late summer, August, September timeframe. And we use a young modified Van Veen grab. The grab takes a sample, it's 0.04 square meters and to a depth of about 15 centimeters into the sediment. The samples are then sieved through a 500 micron sieve, and everything, all the animals that are larger than 500 microns are retained, sorted under a dissecting microscope and identified to the lowest practical taxonomic level. Next. This is just a map of Tampa Bay and overlaid with our sampling grid. And again, we stratify the sampling into the 7 bay segments. You have Hillsborough Bay up in the northeast portion of the bay, Old Tampa Bay in the northwestern lobe of the bay, then Middle Tampa Bay, Lower Tampa Bay, Prassede Bay and Manatee River on the southeastern portion of the bay, and then Boca Ciega Bay over by Pinellas County. Next slide. At each of the stations, we also do in situ hydrographic monitoring at the surface and the bottom. So I'm just going to do a quick summary of some of the physical parameters that we measure at each of the stations. Looking at the bottom salinity, next slide. The average salinity bay-wide is around 25 parts per thousand. We do see a salinity gradient with lower salinities up in Hillsborough Bay and Old Tampa Bay, and higher salinities down in lower portion of the bay. We also have lower salinities in the Manatee River and Prassede Bay portion too because of freshwater inputs. Looking at the temporal trends of salinity, there is some variability from year to year, which tracks rainfall primarily, but most years we fall within a polyhaline sediment or salinity regime between 18 and 30 parts per thousand. Next slide. Another parameter we look at is the bottom dissolved oxygen. Next slide. The average DO bay-wide is around 5 parts per million or milligrams per liter. But up in Hillsborough Bay in particular, we do see incidents of hypoxia, and the average DO up there is around 3.6. And if we look at the temporal trends bay-wide, there's an apparent drop in dissolved oxygen around 2001. However, that's more of a sampling artifact. In that year, we kind of pushed our sampling period up more towards August and September. So we were sampling during a warmer time of the year, so we were seeing lower dissolved oxygen. So that's not really a trend. Next slide. We also do sampling for sediment composition, looking at the percent silt clay. And again, we see a gradient in the sediment composition bay-wide with siltier sediments, particularly up in Hillsborough Bay and around the shipping channels in the Port of Tampa, where we have a lot of silt deposition. And then we get coarser, sandier, and shellier sediments as you move further south in the bay towards Lower Tampa Bay. Again, looking at the temporal trends in silt clays, we have this period where we have really wide standard deviations. That is due largely to a change in our sampling program where we started collecting fewer samples per year, so we're seeing a large variation. Next slide. We also take a sediment sample looking at sediment contaminants. We look at heavy metals, PAHs, PCBs, and chlorinated pesticides. And to summarize those, we calculate the probable effects level ratios. And on this map here shows the distribution of the sediment contaminants in Tampa Bay using the Pell ratios. The red colors are higher levels, of course. You can see that you see most of those sediment contaminants, contaminated sediments are isolated more up towards Hillsborough Bay and in association with the Port Tampa, with a couple other pockets of high sediment contaminants in very other portions of the bay. If you look at the bar graph on the right, again, it's showing that we see higher sediment contaminants in Hillsborough Bay and the gradient of lower sediment contaminations as you move further south towards Lower Tampa Bay. Next slide. Trying to summarize all the physical parameters that we look at, the hydrographic and the sediment the sill clay. I ran a principal coordination analysis, and you can see that the sampling points are color-coded by their base segments, and you can see that the base segments separate out based on their physical parameters. The first principal component is largely weighed by, next slide, by dissolved oxygen and sill clay, with higher sill clays and lower dissolved oxygen in Hillsborough Bay, pulling those samples out. And then the second principal component was largely weighed by salinity, which is why you had lower salinities in Manatee River. Next slide. Going into the biological parameters, the number of taxa, we've identified over 1,150 species found in over 1,791 samples that's been processed during the 25-year period. So we have a, next slide, pretty high diversity. The median number of taxa that we find per sample is around 36, but it ranges from 0 to 176 taxa per sample. But even with that high diversity, 7 taxa accounted for 25% of the cumulative abundance. And 25 taxa accounted for 50% of the cumulative abundance. 363 taxa were present in a single sample, and 294 taxa were represented by a single specimen over a 25-year period. So we have a lot of rare taxa and a few really dominant taxa. Should note that there is a sampling bias using, because of the graph sample that we use, we are sampling primarily smaller organisms in soft sediments, so we're not really capturing the diversity that you see on the harder substrates. And we also, because of the random sampling design too, we don't have a lot of samples that were collected in freshwater or low salinity areas. So a lot of those taxa are underrepresented in our database. Looking at some of the community parameters of species richness, we do see a gradient with lower species richness in Hillsborough Bay and then increasing species richness as you move towards Lower Tampa Bay. And look at temporal trends, we've actually seen an increase in species richness over time. This is most evident since 2012, where we're really starting to see a lot more taxa present. On this slide, also the blue circles, dashed lines is our water quality index that we use for our water monitoring program. And I applied that just to contrast that with the species richness trends. And you can see that they track fairly well together. So the increase in species richness is a good indication of the improving water quality that we see in Tampa Bay. Next slide. Looking at the abundance of benthic organisms, median is 6,325 organisms per meter squared, with a maximum of 183,425 organisms per meter squared. Abundances tend to be higher in older and middle Tampa Bay and also lower Tampa Bay. And if you look at the temporal trends too, similar to what we see with the species richness, we've also seen an increase in the number of actual counts that we've been finding in our benthic samples. Next slide. We also use a benthic index that was developed for our monitoring program by Janicki Environmental. And very similar to what we see with species richness, you see higher benthic index values down in Lower Tampa Bay relative to Hillsborough Bay. And we've also seen increasing trend in the benthic index over time, in particular since around 2011, 2012, it's been increasing. Looking at some of the dominant taxa that we find, again, as I mentioned earlier, 7 taxa account for over 25% of the overall abundance, represented by these 7 taxa, and I'll talk a little bit more about those a little later. Next slide. And 10 taxa were present in, or consistently found in, more than 40% of the samples. Next slide. So looking at some of the dominant taxa that we find, the most abundant benthic organism that we have is a Branchiostoma floridana, which is also called Amphioxus or lancelet. These tend to be congregated more in the shellier, coarser sediments in middle and lower Tampa Bay. And if you look at the population trends over time, we were seeing a reduction in population in abundance down to about 2011, and then increase since around 2012. Next slide. Second most abundant organism we find is a brachiopods, Glatidia, and it is more abundant in finer sandier sediments in middle and old Tampa Bay and Hillsborough Bay. And just looking at the population trends is variable over time. The polychaete Kierkegaardia is a deposit feeder and tends to be concentrated more in the siltier sediments, particularly Hillsborough Bay and then portions of Boca Ciega Bay and Manatee River and Old Tampa Bay. And the population trends have been fairly consistent over time. It's a pretty consistent one that we find. Next slide. The clam Curtiella planulata, it used to be called Mycella planulata, is a really small bivalve, very important food species for a lot of wading birds as well. It tends to be found in siltier sediments, particularly up in Hillsborough Bay and Old Tampa Bay, and in some peripheral areas around Manatee River and Tercea Bay. We were seeing a crash in the population in 2011, but since then it's been an upward trend. Next slide. One of the most abundant crustaceans that we find is the amphipod Amphiliska holmesii. And again, that tends to also be in your siltier sediments too, up in Hillsborough Bay and Old Tampa Bay, Manatee River, Tercea Bay portion. And this population's been fairly consistent over time. Next slide. And then finally, the gastropod Cecum strigosum is one of the more abundant gastropods that we find, particularly in middle and lower Tampa Bay, where it prefers the more coarse sediments as well. And if you look at the long-term population trends, we saw a detrending population trend with this species down to about 2010, where it was almost completely absent from the samples. And in the last couple of years, it's really rebounded. So next slide. Also, looking at the species assemblages by year, we do see some distinct benthic communities over time. From the 1993 through 2002 time period, the samples were largely dominated by Branchiostoma, Cecum strigosum, and Curtiella. 2004, and then the period 2006 to 2009, we saw more of a dominance of Curtiella. 2003 and 2005, both were a little lower salinity those years, so and were dominated largely by Glatidia and paper mussels and Mignolum. And 2010 and 2011 grouped together with a unique species assemblage. And we can skip on to the next slide. Also looking at the assemblages by bay segments, Old Tampa Bay, Hillsborough Bay, Manatee River, and Tercea Bay had a similar species assemblage dominated largely by Amphiliska holmesii and Curtiella and Curtella. Next, Hillsborough Bay and Old Tampa Bay were more similar to each other, dominated largely by Glatidia and Amphiliska and Curtiella. And Manatee River and Tercea Bay clustered together as well, and they were dominated by the bivalve Millennia lateralis. And then the lower portion of the bay, Middle Tampa Bay, Lower Tampa Bay, and Boca Ciega Bay, grouped together largely by the presence of Branchiostoma, as well as a couple other annelids. And in particular, Middle Tampa Bay and Lower Tampa Bay were grouped together by Branchiostoma and Cecums, and Boca Ciega Bay kind of stood out on its own. Was dominated by sporobid polychaetes, which are associated with Thalassia seagrass. And then finally, try to correlate the physical parameters with the Benthic communities in the bio-ENV analysis. And several parameters, depth, DO, salinity, and percent soil clay accounted for, correlated with 0.488. But the strongest correlating parameter was percent soil clay. Next. So in summary, Tampa Bay has a rich diversity of benthic and fauna, but is dominated by relatively few species. The community structure influenced by sediment type and bottom dissolved oxygen. There's an increasing trend in species richness and abundance and in the benthic index over time. This has most been notable since 2012. And this reflects improvements in water quality that we've seen over time. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, who funds our monitoring, and the cooperation of Manatee and Pinellas County, who assist with our field sampling. And thank you, and you guys have time for questions.
So we'll be taking questions at the end of this session. So we'd like to invite you to stay on the stage and write down your questions if you have any, and we'll ask them at the end. Our next presenter is Hilary Stevens. She is a coastal resilience manager at Restore America's Estuaries in Arlington, Virginia, where she oversees blue carbon and the Living Shorelines program.
Good morning. Thank you so much, everyone, for sticking it out here to the last day. And a special thank you also. I gather we have a robust online audience as well, which is great to see. It is wonderful to be here in person. It's been a while. My name is Hilary Stevens. I work with a group called Restore America's Estuaries. We are a national organization based in the Washington, D.C. area. We are an umbrella as an alliance organization of 10 member groups that you see on the map indicated here. Tampa Bay Watch is one of our members. So I was delighted to be able to spend some time with them while I'm here. We serve as an advocate for these groups in Washington, D.C. and a convener. We have a number of programs in living shorelines, blue carbon, water quality. We administer a number of grant programs to fund restoration, and that does include the Tampa Bay Environmental Restoration Fund. We also convene workshops, conferences, and summits. And I particularly want to put in a plug for our Coastal and Estuarine Summit, which will be coming up in New Orleans in December of this year. Because it's in New Orleans, there will be a particular emphasis on the Gulf Coast, and I would love to see as many of you there talking about the work that you've been doing here. The call for proposals is out now, so please take a look at that and consider submitting. I'm going to be talking today about a study that we recently completed on the economic value of estuaries to the U.S. economy. This is an update of a study that we completed in 2009, and we realized that after a decade, it was time to assess the changes that had happened over that time. The original study focused on sort of traditional demographic and economic parameters. We realized with this update that we could really go beyond that it is just as much as it is important to have some parameters about the economic value of estuaries, we can also speak to the ecosystem services that they provide to us, that the science has advanced sufficiently that we can begin to quantify that, and that it is crucial that we do so in order to better communicate the values that these areas provide to us. So this image is of the original study, and you'll see here a map of the lower 48. Due primarily to data constraints, the study does focus on just the continental US by breaking it down into the regions that you'll see indicated here. I don't have time to go into all of the details, but I want to discuss some big take-home messages. So the original body of the study looking at economic and demographic data looks nationwide. And there are a couple of big take-home messages that I took away from that. The first one is that estuary regions have a really outsized impact on our national economy. The next one is that while population growth in these areas pretty much mirrored national population growth, the growth in employment and the growth in GDP in our estuarine regions dramatically outpaced the national and the population growth. So these areas are important and they are becoming more important on an economic scale. The third one is that tourism and recreation is the dominant employment sector in these regions, and that will come as no surprise to Floridians. To highlight some numbers, the estuarine counties, that is the counties that abut our estuaries, represent 4% of the continental landmass. On that 4% live 40% of the population. And that population produce 47% of the GDP. Let that sink in for a minute. Nearly half of our GDP comes from 4% of our landmass. Our estuarine regions are truly critical to the health, wealth, and well-being of our nation. I want to underscore these numbers because part of the reason that we developed this study is to provide tools to folks like you when you are speaking to your leaders, your decision makers, about why they need to invest in protecting and restoring these resources. These numbers are really dramatic. Next. Within that GDP, there are, of course, some sectors that are water dependent and others that are not, that are located in that region simply because of the demographics that the population is there. There's some interesting narratives within those water dependent industries that I think are really critical to highlight. In large urban metropolitan areas, in absolute numbers, the water dependent industries are much larger. And in this time of really out of whack supply chains, suddenly the Port of Los Angeles is making headlines all over the place, and we're all thinking a lot about the need to invest in the infrastructure of our water dependent resources in our big metropolitan cities. Equally important, however, are to remember the rural coastal communities around the country, because in those rural coastal communities, the percentage, the portion of the local economy that is water dependent is much higher. For the folks that live in rural coastal communities, their livelihoods are tied to being coastal. Many more of these people interact with their coastal resources on a daily basis, and their well-being, their livelihood is tied to it. So just as much as it is critical that we invest in the infrastructure of our metropolitan coastal areas, it is also important that we invest in the environmental quality and the access for our rural communities to their coastal resources. Okay, that's the national scale. Now we try to take on putting dollar figures on ecosystem services. That's a massive undertaking, and there's a lot of groundbreaking work to try and get to that point. So the way that we decided to approach this was to choose 6 case studies from around the country, 2 on the West Coast, 2 on the East Coast, 2 on the Gulf Coast, and break down some of the services that they provide. We focused on blue carbon and on natural infrastructure. For blue carbon, we looked at core data that was available through the Smithsonian database, calculated the amount of carbon that is sequestered in those estuaries. In most areas, that's focusing on salt marshes. Of course, here in Tampa, that's focusing on mangroves. And calculated what would be lost. For those of you that heard the talk earlier, we heard about peak collapse. Calculated what would be lost if those ecosystems were degraded such that that carbon is re-released. So that involves looking at the social cost of carbon and at the rate of release of that carbon calculated out over 30 years. So there are a lot of assumptions that had to be made in that calculation, and we always erred on the side of conservatism in terms of how much carbon is in those soils, what social cost of carbon should we use, what discount rate should we use, and so there's a wide range in these calculations. But the numbers that they came up with, looking at all 6 of these estuaries combined for blue carbon, is from 0.6 to $3.7 billion. Now, this does not include future sequestration potential, particularly if any of these habitats we are able to restore and expand them. So again, this is a very conservative number. It's meant to be a starting point for that conversation. But in this time when the administration is focusing on climate mitigation, this is a really powerful tool to have. The next calculation that we did is natural infrastructure. Again, there's a lot of different factors that go into that. And in order to constrain it, we looked very specifically at flood mitigation, at how tidal wetlands mitigate flooding to the built infrastructure behind them. So again, there's a lot of aspects here that we did not include. We did not look at, for example, loss of business activity, loss of damage to human health, or disparate impacts on vulnerable communities. We simply looked at damage to the built environment to the properties that are behind those tidal wetlands. So we looked at all properties that are vulnerable by the FEMA maps, that are vulnerable to the 1% annual chance flood, and what damage would be mitigated by being located behind a tidal wetland, calculated over a 30-year time span, which is the standard used by insurance and financial industries. And again, combining all 6 of the estuaries, we came up with a value of between $1 and $3 billion over the next 30 years. Next slide. Focusing specifically on Tampa Bay, we calculated that there is $148 million worth of real estate that is adjacent to wetlands and is vulnerable to the 1% annual chance flood. The wetlands that protect those areas provide up to $1.35 billion in protection from flood losses over the next 30 years. And I want to emphasize, these are very conservative estimates. These are in today's dollars, and these were using the county assessed value of those properties that is prior to the bonkers real estate market that's happened in the last, 18 months or so. So again, these are very conservative estimates. Because, of course, of the very high real estate values and the widespread presence of mangroves, which are extremely good, much more effective than salt marshes at mitigating flood damage, Tampa was a bit of an outlier compared to the other estuaries. I should also indicate that we tried to do some rough estimates. It begins to get very complicated when you predict forward the impacts of climate change, not looking both at sea level rise and at the change in the storm environment and how that might impact storm surge. But the estimates that they came up with approximately double the amount of monetary value that is protection offered, up to about $2.7 billion over the next 30 years. In terms of blue carbon, I want to again emphasize these are very conservative estimates because there is very limited data on the mangroves that are located here in Tampa. And unlike the other estuaries that we looked at, they do not have mangroves, obviously, because of their northerly locations. And so they are all looking at salt marshes. And the data that we found on the mangroves, the cores don't go as deep. And there were limited data points that we had to work with. But the calculations that we came back with are between $7.7 and $44 million in blue carbon. And again, this is in avoided losses if those areas were to be degraded or destroyed over the next 30 years. It does not speak to the potential sequestration as new mangrove areas are colonized and as mangroves mature. Another factor of how mangroves compare with salt marshes is that mangroves become better able to sequester as they mature because you have the additional biomass, whereas salt marshes kind of come to maturity comparatively quickly. So those are the estimates that we have. There's a lot under the hood in terms of methodology to break down. And again, I want to emphasize these are all very conservative, and the methods were designed to be comparable at a national level, which means these methods arguably are not the most specific to this site, but we developed them because this is a national level study and we want to be able to compare methods across from one estuary to the next. We did this study because we exist to serve folks like you and to give you tools to allow you to better advocate for yourselves, speak to the folks in Tallahassee, speak to the folks in Washington, D.C. So I want to make available everything that we have here. The entire study, including the text of the case study on Tampa Bay, is available on our website. I have an infographic if you'd care to grab it, and I welcome questions about the methodology or the findings. And with that, I do want to thank NOAA for supporting us in this study. And I guess we'll take questions at the end. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much.
Next, we're going to have a joint presentation by Kathy Hill and Bob Allen. Kathy Hill is the Deputy Director of the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program in Sebastian, Florida. And Bob Allen is the founder and Chief Storytelling Officer of Ideas, which is a company that uses distinctive storytelling to create, activate, and engage audiences.
Thanks. Morning, everybody. So I'm here, I've got the easy part of this presentation. I'm just here to get Bob rolling. So I'm gonna just do 2 quick slides and then turn Bob loose on you. And he's gonna tell you all about the importance of how he helped us rebrand our program when it was in a sort of vulnerable state, and how that has helped us get, well, not only get, but to do our jobs better and to touch our communities in ways that we had not connected with before. Next. So our program's been around since 1991. We existed as a program of the St. Johns River Water Management District for almost 30 years or 30 years. And in 2015, the program got reorganized and it came under the sponsorship of the IRL Council, which was a brand new organization. Nobody knew what to expect from that. Our partners were squirrely. They weren't sure what to expect from us. We had some people actively working against us and not joining us again. And, you know, to the public, what is this IRL Council? We don't know what that is. And so we needed some help. And we wanted to be able to just reassure everybody that, you know, the NEP is still the NEP. We're going to continue doing what we do, and we're going to have more money to do it with. So it was super important to reach the partners that we had that are doing restoration in the community and let them know that everything's fine, it's all going to be good. Next. So over the last 7 years, Bob and his team has helped us create a whole suite of things, not least of which is our new logo, which sort of respects our old logo, if those of you who remember that, but refreshed. And so we have a new brand charter, long form videos, short form videos, 15-second ads that influence behavior change, just a whole suite of things. And I think at this point, I'm just gonna turn it over to Bob. Bob helped us build trust with our partners and let everybody know that we're still around. And I'm just gonna let you talk.
Thank you, Kathy. Yeah, and it's not Bob. Bob is the mouthpiece. I work with a very talented team of about a dozen people who have done this. So we can go ahead here. I'm gonna give you 46 years worth of fooling around in brands in about 8 minutes. So I'll probably talk pretty quick. So the thing is, if you lock a bunch of people in a room and say, hey, what's a brand? 2 things will happen. If there are 6 people, you get 22 definitions and also a fist fight. So I'm going to give you our definition of what a brand is because we think it's important that it not be confused with things like logos and cut lines and that kind of stuff. So this is Wikipedia's definition. And then if you really look at the key, this is our definition, right? Or one of them. It's the most valuable thing you have. It is the bucket that carries all of your shareholder or stakeholder value around. And it has really very little to do with your logo. It's nice if they're pretty, but you need to do a lot more work before you can figure that out. Here's our definition. It is this intentional story within which you encounter your audiences, and you have a complex set of audiences in your world. And it's how you connect their reason for caring about your reason for being. If your brand is not doing that, you have what we call a lazy brand. So when we started, we like metrics. We're not scientists like all of you, and I love the science, but we do like metrics, and we like to reverse engineer. So these were the broad goals of Kathy's board, saying, hey, look, we want passionate advocacy in the community. We'd like to make sure we're not living hand to mouth all the time in terms of our funding. We want a longer term strategy. And by the way, we want a healthy ecosystem in the IRL. Said, okay, we'll take that on. So the way you go about that is we decompose that into some performance metrics for the brand, right? And these are not the performance metrics, they are some of them. If you engage in a branding process, we hope you work with us, but however you do it, don't do it without knowing what good looks like. This is what good looks like. If we get better lifelong relationships, we get growing commitment, we get a high intent to recommend social media as your friend, unless it's your enemy. We want growing engagement over time. We want to retain, there's an internal component, right? We want the people who work with Kathy to say, I love being here. This is great. You want to keep your really good people energized. And then we want measurable real world gains. We want the condition of the Indian River Lagoon estuary to improve over time. So we said, our brand is going to help do those things, and we're going to keep measuring these to see if we're doing our work. So one more bump there, Ed. Thank you. So Kathy mentioned it. Branding really at its best is a form of behavior change communication. We don't do this for the creative glory. We do this to make people act differently. And really good brands, that's the gold standard, right? And that so a good brand has verbal and physical, and environmental and interpersonal components. And that brand is active all the time out there with your constituencies. We're looking for this as the proof of the pudding. So we have a fairly unusual way of doing branding. We are not an advertising company or a marketing company. Our background is the Walt Disney Company. We've created theme parks and entertainment and stuff our whole life. So we build brands with stories. And the key thing is that we build them from the audience out, not from the ground up. And so these things in the little black box here are steps. So the first thing was a robust process to engage a bunch of stakeholders saying, hey, what's the story? And we really write a very, very high level narrative. And it's really narrative. It's got characters and action and plot and setting and tears, gnashing of teeth, combat, all kinds of fun things in it. That narrative becomes the fundamental basis for what we call a brand experience design plan, which contains a charter, which is your brand's constitution. And then we can talk about identity, and then we can talk about the most important part of brand activation, which is why it comes so early in the cycle, is enculturation. The people inside the organization have to know how to live the brand before you take it to the market, or you will miss each other in the night. And this enculturation process was extremely robust. We really spent some great time with not just the internal folks, but a whole network of regional stakeholders. Then we can talk about the normal stuff, collateral and what's it look like, and how do we make a new website, and then a whole content library, as Kathy mentioned, along with a whole bunch of activation strategies. So those are the steps you have to go through. And I lay this out to give a key warning, which is you can't do a new brand and then the Friday following say, hey, it's not working. Brands are not advertising slogans. They take years to develop and mature. And so you can measure the whole way, and you should, and we'll talk about that. But it's not flipping a light switch. But you really have to do this in a methodical way. So activation is a term, a marketing jargon term that gets thrown around a lot. Really, it's just anything that gets people excited about you. It can be anything from, a sign spinner in front of your store to a very sophisticated online gamified environment, and anything in between. We've been able to do over the last 3 years activation campaigns really with these thematics. So the first one was, hi, One Lagoon, we're a brand, we like you, you need to like us. The second year was, we want you, Joe, and you, Mary, to care personally. How do we get you engaged personally? And we did some of that. This year is about victories, right? Because what we say about the Indian River Lagoon is, we got some real issues, and every one of them is solvable, and we're moving the needle every day. And if we call out those victories, people will begin to rally to that, and we'll get more victories. The way we do that is with a very robust multi-channel social media activation, a constantly refreshed website environment, a video library. Sorry, I'm going to whack that thing 3 or 4 more times. Things like this, and there are other stuff. There's other kind of magical things we're working on, long-form documentary films, even an app, even a game. We're going to get Kathy on board one of these days, because one of the things we like to do is we want 8-year-olds to like this brand, because if we get them when they're 8, we'll own them until they're 88. So, and I used to work for a company that figured out that every 7 years there's a new crop of 7-year-olds, and they all want to watch Snow White. And then later on, they're adults, they have kids, and their kids make them take them to Disney World. So there are outcomes, and kind of in terms of behavior change, here's what we look. First, we want you to know, and then we want you to engage. then we want you, and we are giving you, particularly with our video suite, for instance, right now you can go on the website, we'll give you 32 different things you can do at your house that will directly impact the health of the Indian River Lagoon. That's behavior change. And then finally, we hope to see an improvement, in our estuary. I mean, again, there's no, as you know, there's no big bad wolf out there that we can point to. It's death by 1,000 cuts, and it's restoration by 1,000 Band-Aids. So that's what we're really looking at. So the formula then is, execute, measure, assess, repeat. We like you, we like data, we like measurement. We don't do it, but we work with some companies who do. This is just one sample. One of the easy metrics is look at your social media analytics, look at your website analytics. How's our bounce rate doing? What's our dwell time on the site? Those give us some indication of what works and what doesn't. And sometimes you can't figure it out. We'll run a digital ad and all of a sudden the website will just go off the chart for 5 days. It's like, well, which ad was that? Well, we don't know. We had 3 out there. So you do have to look, right? So we want the metrics to know, because resources are constrained, right? You don't have an endless amount of money. So that's a whirlwind tour through branding. I'll just recap. Story, audience first, then story, then charter, then you build a brand, then you teach it, and then you activate it, and then you measure it, and over time you make sure you're going down the road. Thanks very much for having us. We appreciate being here.
Our next presenter is going to be presenting remotely, and Prassede Vella is the staff scientist for the MassBays National Estuary Partnership in Boston, Massachusetts, where she coordinates water quality work, habitat monitoring, and grant programs. And she'll be presenting about a framework for setting long-term targets for MassBays.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for having me here today. Although remotely, which we were there. During this presentation, I will go over a multi-step process on which we've been working with many partners to develop a framework for setting long-term environmental targets for MassBays. Next slide, please. One of the goals of RCCMP is to establish long-term target conditions for our NAP. For this purpose, we have been developing a framework approach to measure progress in improving habitat and water quality conditions over time. Next, please. MassBays' 1,100 miles of coastline is characterized by a complex geomorphology that includes barrier beaches, rocky coast, and estuaries. Some of the hardest environmental challenges take place in estuaries by the very nature of their location and hydrography. Estuaries are rich in natural resources, drawing plenty of commercial and recreational uses, as we just heard in Hilary's presentation. However, estuarine resources are often very vulnerable. Many estuaries tend to be densely populated and are often impacted from anthropogenic conditions such as wastewater and stormwater discharge, tidal restrictions, habitat loss and fragmentation, and where the impacts of climate change, such as increased storms and flooding, are most felt. MassBays is home also to almost 30% of the population of Massachusetts, living in 50 communities that vary from highly urbanized to rural in parts. Next slide, please. One of the management priorities in our estuaries is to address research and science gaps to inform habitat restoration. So as a first step, we delineated our planning area to try to make it more manageable into 68 assessment areas, creating a landward boundary up to the head of tide and a seaward boundary to include estuarine resources out to the photic zone at about the 10-meter bathy. We then characterized each assessment area using datasets with estuarine resources such as eelgrass and salt marsh, and stressors including hardened shoreline and impaired waters, to name a few. Of the 68 assessment areas shown in the map to the right, 47 of those are embayments. These were grouped by similarity using principal component analysis of the resource and stressor criteria. This created 4 categories or clusters of embayments, which will guide the implementation of specific management strategies to improve habitat conditions. And we'll come back to this in a minute. Next slide. So what do we want our NAP to look like on the long term, say by 2050? To answer this question, we need to look at what this estuary looked like historically, look at current conditions, and use this information to help forecast future conditions. This process could be quite complicated given the limited availability of historical data the changes in habitat conditions we have seen over decades of development and land use change, and the uncertainty of the future in regard to climate change. To model future conditions, we apply the biological condition gradient, or BCG, a tool developed by EPA originally for use in streams, but with their help and with the help of EPA's Office of Research and Development, we're now piloting it for use in estuaries. The BCG helps identify future conditions based on historic and current conditions and looking at various future scenarios to attain desired targets. Based on data availability, we decided to go with 3 estuarine habitats: eelgrass, saltmarsh, and tidal flats, for which to develop targets using the BCG. Next slide. The first step was to look at the planning area at the embayment scale through a physical and geomorphological lens. This let us identify the suitability of an embayment to support a specific habitat or habitats. We call these ecotypes, and we characterized each of the 47 embayments into one of 4 ecotypes based on 3 criteria: exposure to wave action, amount of sediment, and water depth. The map on the left shows the color-coded embayments by ecotype. The yellow ecotypes includes protected embayments with abundant sediment. These are usually low-energy embayments with abundant salt marsh. For example, areas on the North Shore, as you can see there, around the Great Marsh, and areas around Cape Cod Bay to the south, which are characterized by sandy beaches, are in this category. The orange ecotype embayments are also relatively protected and low energy, but with limited sediment available. These tend to form natural harbors and are usually urbanized, such as the Boston Harbor and Salem Sound areas in orange in the map. Embayments in the green ecotype are more exposed and subject to moderate energy waves. They have abundant sediment and tend to support more extensive eelgrass, or historically they did, and areas with tidal flats, such as Provincetown at the tip of Cape Cod Bay. The fourth ecotype, blue, is highly exposed with high energy waves and therefore with little sediment. Such areas have rocky shores and are usually characterized with macroalgae such as rockweed and kelp. We have only one embayment on this, the Rockport at the tip of Cape Ann, that fell in this category. The significance of these ecotype categories is that they allow us to better understand what habitats and ecosystems and embayment can support, and therefore where it is viable to consider restoration, where you get most bang for the buck. Next slide. Then came an exciting piece, looking for historical data for eelgrass, saltmarsh, and tidal flats. EPA ORD was a great asset in this step, digging into historic charts as far back as the 1770s and developing data layers. Of course, not all these data could be used. The mapping was different then and done for different reasons sometimes, subject to interpretation, and complex analysis and lots of decisions had to be made to figure out which maps to include or drop. In addition, substantial changes had taken place in certain locations, often enough to render the data not usable for this purpose. So for example, the area around Boston Harbor that used to be tidal marsh was filled in around the 1850s so that the original marsh extent cannot be recovered. However, there were enough data to generate some historic layers for saltmarsh and tidal flats. Over time, we lost significant amounts of eelgrass and saltmarsh in various embayments around MassBays through changes in land use, increase in impervious surface, changes in agricultural practices, and impacts of climate change. This graphic here depicts changes over time. As you can see, there were the historical, then it dips down towards what we have today. Excuse me. What we have today, and showing also what the future may look like. The future part of the image shows various scenarios or options depending on the capacity available and how invested are communities in a brighter future. The BCG tool applied to each embayment will show what can be attained over time under different future scenarios: increased conservation and restoration, for example, or doing just some conservation or maintaining business as usual. Next slide. And if you can click 2 more times, please. The BCG tool allows us to start looking at possible long-term targets for each habitat type. Because embayments within each ecotype are similarly suited for supporting a specific habitat or habitats, we identified long-term targets for each habitat type by ecotype. The targets are associated with either areal extent or with condition of each habitat or both. Next slide. So as you can see in this table, in several cases, especially for eelgrass, targets were selected to restore aerial extent of eelgrass beds to the 1995 levels, the most historic year where we have statewide data in which we can be relatively confident. If there is no longer enough space to expand, for example, focusing on improving the health of a habitat is also an important target. As you can see in the table, salt marsh surrounded by development, for example, may no longer have room to expand. However, efforts can be dedicated to eliminating phragmites, for example, by removing tidal restrictions, or transplanting, which improves hydrology and enhances the growth of native salt marsh species. In this case, the target would be a whole line approach for aerial extent and improving condition in terms of habitat health. Next slide. And if you can click 3 more times, please. Because habitat improvement is often a slow process, we developed associated metrics so that we can track progress over the short term as management actions are put in place and implemented. So for example, restoring eelgrass where it's been lost due to degraded water clarity may first require the reduction of stormwater discharge. Planning, designing, and constructing stormwater BMPs may take several years if funding is even available. And post-construction, it will take some time for water clarity to be restored and eelgrass to grow back. Therefore, over time, we'll monitor water quality improvements by measuring parameters such as turbidity, DO, temperature, to keep track of progress towards long-term targets. The process of target setting was conducted with oversight from our Science and Technical Advisory Committee, as well as input from various subject matter experts. As the final step, we started also looking into developing ecosystem services for each of the 3 habitats. Next slide. Each habitat provides a suite of ecosystem services, as we heard earlier in this session, that benefit other organisms within the ecosystems, as well as communities which depend on the habitats for their well-being. Therefore, communicated to local communities and stakeholders about how ecosystem services improve with better habitat conditions is beneficial in garnering local support. Examples of ecosystem services provided by salt marsh, for example, include clean water, food such as shellfish and fish, recreational opportunities such as birding or kayaking, economic benefits, and shoreline protection such as buffering against storms and waves. Next slide. Our priority was to gather information on ecosystem services that resonate with stakeholders who live around, work in, and recreate or utilize our estuaries. Basically, wanted answers to these 3 questions. What are the local priorities in their communities? What ecosystem services do communities care about? And who are the top beneficiary groups in their region? Next slide. So in December 2020, we conducted a series of workshops in collaboration with researchers from UMass Boston to identify priority ecosystem services associated with eelgrass and salt marsh, with local expert input. Local experts included representatives from various sectors, such as harbor masters, nonprofits, tourism industry, researchers, and the indigenous community. A workshop was held for stakeholders from each of the 4 embayment categories shown in the map on the right. These embayment categories are the ones I described earlier, which were clustered together based on their similarities of resources and stressors. A deliberative multi-criteria evaluation method was used, 1 to assess community-based values of coastal ecosystem services, and 2 to explore spatial variability of group values along the MassBays coast. Next slide. So 4 ecosystem services were selected to apply to both eelgrass and salt marsh habitats, including biodiversity, measured by fish abundance, food availability and security, which was measured by shellfish landings, coastal resiliency, measured by blue carbon equivalents, and clean water, measured by nitrogen uptake. Stakeholders provided preferences for these ecosystem services based on a series of trade-off analysis. Our results show that coastal stakeholders hold a particular emphasis on the need for access to clean water. Next. And services that provide direct economic benefits. Next. Differences in the quantitative and qualitative results between groups provide insight into the need for localized policymaking instead of just regional or statewide management. Next slide. The resource stressors categories take into account natural estuaries as well as anthropogenic similarities and differences across embayments. Knowing which stressors are driving habitat conditions will help us meet our goals by guiding change and supporting work at the local level. Next slide. So similar local actions and strategies can be used in different embayments within a resource stressor category. So for example, here you can see embayments in category 4 are characterized by extensive salt marsh, varying egress extent, and fewer tidal restrictions. At the same time, habitat conditions are driven by higher bacterial impairments due to a prevalence of septic systems. To improve conditions, local action would, for example, include addressing wastewater discharge, protecting marsh buffers, and working to expand egress areas and restore egress where it's been lost. Next slide. In another example, embayments in category 3 are characterized by high bacteria impairment, high intensity in land use and urbanization, high degree of shoreline hardening, and more tidal restrictions. Local action in these embayments would include retrofitting impervious surfaces, addressing tidal restrictions, and creating habitat on shoreline structures. Next slide. And finally, there is more immediate work to be done as we continue working on developing an ecosystem service gradient in collaboration with the PA over the next year. We're developing also an eco-health tracking tool for measuring and documenting incremental progress using environmental parameters, and this will be an online tool that provides visual displays of conditions and trends in our planning area. We hope that policymakers and environmental managers will use these observations to address local values and priorities as we implement habitat restoration efforts. Next slide. And last but not least, want to acknowledge and thank all of our partners who provided funding, data, and continued support, as well as our staff for their valuable and expert input. And thank you for having me here today. I realize this was a lot to cover, so feel free to contact me. The information is here on the slides. Thank you.
Our final presentation for this session will also be delivered remotely. Mike Wessel works as a consultant on natural resource management issues ranging from water quality and water supply to identifying condition indices for seagrass and tidal creeks. And he will be presenting on the application of conceptual models to advance tidal creek management.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm really sorry I couldn't be there in person today. And this talk really started as a conversation with my co-authors, especially Ernst Peebles, about creek ecology, conceptual models, the need to advance the application of these concepts into management actions, and the frustration that these creeks really don't get the management attention they deserve. And I really like the phrase Sheila used earlier, paddle faster. Come on. Sometimes with creeks research, there's long stretches of time when it's hard to even find a paddle, honestly. And I'd like to give a quick shout out to Peter Clark, if he's in the audience, who first proposed the need for a tidal creek management strategy for this area back in 1991 at a BASIS conference, at the first BASIS conference. I don't think he thought it would take this long to implement a strategy for tidal creeks. But so this presentation is really kind of a summary of where we are in Southwest Florida with tidal creeks management, some lessons learned, and part trying to map out a long-term vision to keep the paddles hitting the water, so to speak, on tidal creeks research. Next, please. The basis of this talk is a newly created tidal creeks dashboard and water quality assessment framework. It's designed to provide an evaluation of tidal creek water quality conditions across a large population of tidal creeks using a report card style format. And it has a host of site-specific indicators of creek condition that resource managers can utilize to help prioritize management actions. So you can see on the figure on the left, displaying the assessment outcomes for the entire population of over 300 creeks in Southwest Florida, the study area between Tampa Bay and Estero Bay. And you can, with the dashboard tool that Marcus Beck, our co-author, developed, you can draw a polygon over any particular area of interest and summarize the creek conditions across creeks, or you can select any specific creek and drill down into the various water quality aspects that make up the final score. So for example, this the bar plots on the right are Frog Creek, and you can see in the top left or top right panel where total nitrogen concentrations were about 1.4, 1.5 up to about 2016. And then there were some improvements to a wastewater treatment plant that was intermittently discharging to Frog Creek in 2016. And after that, they dropped down to around 1. So, you know, there's still a lot of room. There's still low-hanging fruit out there, and you can make significant progress in improving water quality, rapidly. And another interesting outcome of this is if you look on the top left bar plot, you see that actually chlorophyll values kind of went up during this period of time, and it may be due to the reduced volumes of wastewater that were going in, increasing the residence times. But these systems are really complex, and so it takes a dashboard where you can really kind of drill down into different aspects of the water quality conditions. But this application has been a great accomplishment for us, but it's really a dramatic simplification of all the work that's gone into Tidal Creek research here in Southwest Florida. Next, please. The dashboard was based on 2 studies that we, Janicki Environmental, managed with Moat Marine Lab. And just a shout out to Kelly Dixon, who recently retired from Moat. It was funded by EPA, administered by the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program, and conducted jointly with the 3 contiguous NEPs of Southwest Florida in partnership with the 6 coastal counties who provided in-kind services. And really, this study would not have been possible without the NEPs, their relationship with the local governments, and it's just been an honor to be a part of that. But the results of this study are contained in 2 really large, voluminous reports with appendices that add to a really extensive kind of compendium of literature out there on tidal creeks. But we really are trying to make this a lot more accessible and easily digestible by using some new tools you've heard about this week, open science, so that all this work doesn't really just get relegated to the archives of literature, but can be easily accessible to track down and digest. And so next slide, please. The first thing, for example, we had to do was create a definition of a tidal creek and develop inclusion criteria for the study and come to an agreement on a goal for tidal creek function. And really, as a joint tack of the 3 estuary programs, we agreed that a healthy creek should have a lot of fish in it, and that the job of a tidal creek is really to export nutrients as fish biomass. And so this was our first application of a conceptual model, but the model wasn't the first conceptual model of tidal creeks by a long shot. Ernst had described this kind of process as the tidal river engine in some work he had done earlier, and there's really been decades of research that preceded the study that we've leaned on. Next slide. One of those was presented at Basis 5, and there's a whole volume of work on that by Ernst and the Tidal Trib research team that Ed Sherwood led, and they presented several conceptual models illustrating, among other things, how nutrient assimilation is affected by water column light field and how that relates to the role of benthic algae in supporting the tidal creek food web. And when we did our study, we really tried to key in on this as one line of evidence that we were pursuing to develop some criteria for these creeks. Next slide, please. Of course, we can go back farther than that in terms of conceptual models, back to Lewis et al., who described the estuary independence of life history dynamics of fish species in Florida, and the list goes on down the line, with each model having some common attributes and some attributes that are specific to the particular area of interest. And so you'll find that with these, you can kind of spend your life doing these conceptual models, and a lot of them are interrelated, but each one is particular to their own particular research hypothesis in a lot of ways. So next slide, please. So we're really trying to use these conceptual models to distill scientific information and bridge the divide between research, management, and regulation. But we really have a long way to go in terms of implementing these conceptual models within a management framework that can be actualized. And we really need some mechanism by which to keep track of these ideas and the research that's conducted so that we can, lean on it as we move forward without having to sift through a lot of reports, and which is really a timely process. And as I said, these tidal creeks have really lagged behind other estuarine ecosystem resources in terms of dedicated management strategy and regulatory protections. So we need to really accelerate the science. Next slide, please. And these are just some of the conceptual models that we used in our study. We had a stressor response model, simple stressor response model on the left that we used to test some hypotheses related to developing criteria It goes out to a kind of a larger watershed management model where we tried to identify what we could control and what we could manage, and then, you know, a more complex ecological model that, you know, in reality, we ended up for the criteria that we used, using a reference condition approach, because we really didn't find that there was a unifying stress response relationship that could be used as a one size fits all to develop like a single protective criterion value that would protect all of these creeks. There's really a lot of site specific complexity to it. So unfortunately, that means a lot more work and a lot more you know, research to get where we need to go. Next slide, please. So what we're proposing is really is to use these open science tools with the current dashboard that we have developed as a foundation to try and add additional information on these various aspects of tidal creek research using the conceptual models to help bridge the science management gap. Next slide. So if we go back to the dashboard, you'll see that it's set up with a landing page that includes an overview page, as well as a details, a report card, and an indicator page, and then finally a link to all the source code on the right that drives the dashboard, which is contained within this GitHub repository. And a GitHub repository, or a GitHub, is just really a web-based hosting platform for code and collaboration that serves as a core tool for open science. And so, you know, combined with R and the associated packages, you can create websites like the Tidal Creek dashboard. And so, you know, and then you can embed things within this dashboard. So you'll see within like the last couple of paragraphs, there's this link in the here in all caps. And that was just a link that I created using an additional, you know, GitHub repository to keep track of updates that I had done, as well as forward different aspects of research that I believe are areas to pursue in future work, because you can't really cram everything into one site. You have to have these kind of hierarchies. So if you, next slide, please. So clicking on the dashboard takes you to the home page of this, this additional resource page that I developed, where, for example, when we updated the dashboard to run 61, we ran into some hurdles, and so there's an explanation of that. And then there's this additional resources page that has different aspects of the study, and they're really excerpts from the report, but they're all kind of located in this one place that you can access all together. And all of this, of course, is captured within GitHub, within this web hosting platform, but it's more easily accessible if you have it on a web page. And so, next slide, please. Actually, could you go one more, please? One more. Yeah, so ideally, you know, the idea is that we can use these open science tools and create some kind of infographic. So we would have all the different aspects of Tidal Creek research that were laid out with hyperlinks, and then you would be able to drill down and click on each one of these topics, and you'd find more information on Tidal Creek's research within that. And then in the slide that I skipped, if you go back one, that is a way for anyone. We really want to open it up for anyone to be able to make a commit. That is what it's called on GitHub. Is you make a commit where really this is just an example of where you would upload a PDF of your research or an idea, or submit an issue for future research, in a way that we're really creating kind of a community of practice for Southwest Florida tidal creeks, which is really kind of the goal, in the same way that surf has recently created this community of practice for seagrass. And so I think it's really needed, and that's kind of the long-term vision. It's not going to happen within the next 6 months. If you could move forward 2 slides, please. So in summary, the Tidal Creeks dashboard has really proven to be a valuable tool for resource managers to prioritize actions among a large population of creeks. It was recently expanded into Clearwater Harbor and St. Joseph Sound, which was not part of our original study, but it really demonstrated the external validity of this approach that we use. But the dashboard really only scratches the surface of defining important linkages that govern tidal creek condition. And you know, in order to really integrate the research on this highly multidisciplinary field, we need to have tools like this to accelerate the science, really, to protect these critical coastal habitats. And the advent of open source tools and open science principles are really seen as an effective and efficient mechanism to facilitate this integration. And TBEP is really leading the way in bridging the gap between research and management using this open science. And I'm all on board with that. So that's what I have. And these are just some photos of really how cool these creeks are and how valuable they are as fish habitat.
So at this time, we can now open the floor for questions. We have about 20 minutes. So raise your hand if you have a question, and also please let us know which of the presenters you would like to answer your question.
Check. So this question is for IRL and Ideas Inc., which first and foremost, I'd like to say thank you. I really appreciate that conversation being included in this larger conversation. You were definitely speaking my language. You spoke about enculturation, and I was wondering if you could expand a little bit upon what that really looks like, who's engaged in that process, and specifically in the context of NEPs, you know, really just what that looked like, and maybe the timeline too. Is it a gradual process?
Sure.
Yeah.
So the way we do it, you know, again, once we figure out the branch charter, which has these 7 components, some of those are really, really easily reflected as behavior. So we take those, and the way we do enculturation is we literally go and do video work with the key leadership in the organization and key stakeholders saying, hey, here's a component of our vision. How does that look on you? Tell us that story. Oh, if this is our mission, what do you do every day to achieve? So we build it around those actuals. And then we actually find that particularly with a distributed environment like this, we will create a online learning platform, for lack of a better terms, nothing fancy, but it allows you to do it asynchronously, 20 minutes or less of seat time, real easy. Everybody gets the same story. So that's kind of how we do it. It goes midway in the process. You have to figure the brand and the story out first, then you enculturate, and then you can move toward activation out in the market. In a typical branding assignment for us, you know, nominally to get from Jump Street to, okay, we're ready to go to market, 3 to 4 months usually is the time frame, and somewhere toward the last third of that is where we would normally do the enculturation piece. So yeah, it's really if you look at activation, it's actually it's more powerful than your advertising, more powerful than your website. Once people know how to wear the brand around, you get a whole bunch of evangelists out there. So does that answer your question? Thank you.
So, and raise your hand so I know where to come next.
I'm going to read one of the questions from the chat while you're finding someone in the room. This question is for Dave Karlen from Pam DeBona. She is so jealous of the Benthic data set we have here in Tampa Bay. Can you talk about how we justify the Benthic monitoring program? At MassBays, they get questions about why they need to spend money on this type of monitoring. So she guesses she's asking what sort of ecosystem benefits you bring forward to support the investment.
Well, I guess it might actually be a better question for Ed, since the Estuary program actually is paying for the monitoring program. But I mean, the benefit of benthic monitoring, from my side, is that it integrates a lot of the other things that are going on in the bay. I mean, you're looking at sediment contaminants, you're looking at water quality, and you're seeing how it's directly affecting the community itself, you know. And you know, benthic organisms are ideal for using for environmental monitoring because they're non-motile, they're in contact with the sediments, they're in contact with the water, and they're really the base of the food chain for fisheries. And in fact, the whole field of benthic ecology originated as a field of fisheries ecology. Because of the importance of benthic organisms in the commercial fisheries. So hopefully that helps answer that question. Thank you.
I have a similar follow-up question for Dave.
So that was awesome, just seeing how you broke up the community composition by bay segment. I was wondering if you noticed that there were any organisms that were like biological indicators of either poor or good water quality.
Yes, and I really unfortunately didn't include that in the presentation as much as I should have probably. We do have a 25-year monitoring report that's available as a PDF, either through the Estuary Program's technical publication website or through the EPC website or ResearchGate. One of the analyses I did, it was called a Simper analysis, where I looked at which taxa contributed to different parameters, including healthy, intermediate, or poor, using the indexes, using the Tampa Bay Benthic index or the AMBI index. And there's several taxa that consistently fall out in good habitats, like Branchiostoma, and a lot of your filter feeding organisms like that, are good indicators of healthy habitats. There's certain organisms, acorn worms in particular, some of the polychaetes that are deposit feeding or more adapted to low dissolved oxygen conditions, and siltier sediments seem to be more tolerant to polluted habitats. So looking at the overall community structure and the species assemblages, you can really kind of hone in on the health of that particular portion of the bay. So, thanks.
My question is for the Restore America's Estuaries. Is that program integrated into the community rating system for floodplain managers for the values? Because the 1.35 billion in protection and flood loss for 30 years is significant. So is that built in to that program, or are you not?
It is not.
Okay.
No. We used some of the FEMA, we used the FEMA flood maps to determine which properties fall into the 1% annual chance flood to generate those calculations. But to my knowledge, FEMA has not incorporated any of our findings into anything that they're doing. Does that answer your question?
So I think what would be really helpful is if the local communities that are in charge of managing their community rating system got their hands on this report, because that's really the way that they would change their score. I want to make sure that we move to where the mics are so everybody, including the 50 people online, can hear us. So.
Hello. This is a question for Mike Wessels. In relation to the conceptual models of tidal creeks, and I'd expand that to bay environments as well, has there been much work done on multiple stable phases and kind of like state and transition models, similar to what they use out in kind of western grassland areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know that Sean King had done some work on that on the Springs Coast here in Florida as well. And Ernst Peebles, my co-author, I'm not sure whether he's in the audience or not, but he did a study that looked at the relative contribution of water column production versus benthic microalgae production along a gradient of systems between the Springs Coast rivers and the surface-fed rivers. And tried to use that as a indicator of the state of the ecosystem. Ernst, are you on? No, maybe not. But that's I think that's as close as anyone has gotten that I'm aware of. And Ed, you might know more than me on that.
No, I don't.
No.
Yeah.
No, but Mike.
It's tough because one of the hard things about tidal creeks is that we really haven't identified concrete biological response indicators for tidal creeks. We don't have seagrass. We try and use fish, but they're highly variable. water column chlorophyll values are really dependent on a lot of external factors like shading and things like that. So even just identifying the appropriate biological response endpoints has been a challenge.
Mike, I have a question for you too. So there's a number of challenges in implementing recommendations to improve these tidal creek systems. They also represent a really important and valuable opportunity to connect with folks who maybe don't live directly on the coastlines. So one of the things that we're looking at the Tampa Bay Estuary program is ways we can take the tidal creek dashboard and those creeks that are prioritized based on all of the work that you outlined in your presentation, and then overlay that with demographic information to find those communities that are perhaps not being served by our organizations, and then figure out ways to work in those areas to improve those tidal creeks and work with those communities to engage them in the process and make their, their neighborhoods and their homes better. Have you thought at all about how we could bring this work in an engaging way to community folks?
That's a great question, and it's something I would love to be a part of. I haven't had the opportunity to, I guess, really pursue that line, but I would love to help in any way I could. Yeah, I think it's a great idea, and it's really needed. You can see the degradation of some of these creeks, and there's some really pretty simple fixes still, I think, for them. Sure.
I have another question for Mike. In your approach to the conceptual ecological models, have you looked at work the Everglades has done with their comprehensive Everglades restoration plan? There was a whole lot of CEMs that were developed for the entire process.
Yeah, I wish they had a dashboard type tool that I could quickly, go through all that, because I know there's been a ton of work done. I have seen some of it, but I'm definitely not an expert in the Everglades work for sure. But you're right, there has been a lot of conceptual modeling. And like I said, it's a fine line, because from my point of view, you could spend your life doing conceptual models, but at the same time, you really need to affect change. And even if you don't get it exactly right, you need to start doing something.
I think we're taking two more, and I've got one right here.
And I've got the other one.
So sorry about this question, but one of the big things that I see emerging, and from the service perspective, is yes, we have all of this long-term data, but I also am getting more pressure to get the data more real-time, more faster, both internally and externally, which is actually a really positive thing, because it means people are becoming more aware. So I think my question maybe I apologize, from ideas, or I made a note about the eco health tracking tool. With some of those, with the branding and or that tool specifically, is it focusing on faster data communicated out to public? And I know there's always we need time to QA/QC it, we need to have our messaging in place, but in this day and age, people want to know, and they want it timely, and that's definitely a challenge that I'm seeing, and I'm not quite sure how to address that.
I'll take that one. So ideas is more for our communication side of things. It's not for the science side of the house per se. They take sort of the science information that we feed them and turn it into things that are engaging for the public, for our partners, and for people who might use those resources. That kind of question, we're dealing with that too on our side, but where we're moving more of a continuous monitoring effort. So things are moving in that direction. Of course, it's expensive. Of course, it takes time, but it takes less time. And then you have all of the things that go along with, if you have continuous monitoring, then you need to QA/QC what your data is. Are your sensors still good? How long has it been in the water? Is it fouled? There's all kinds of things that go with that. So I don't see a good solution to this problem, either through continuous monitoring or through the communication side of the house. It's just a tough situation.
Can I add that?
Yeah.
You need both.
Yeah.
You need to understand the system and you need to communicate well.
Right.
There's a variety of different tools that we use and apply. We're learning about them today through this conference. So
sure.
Yeah, that's.
Use the mic, yeah.
So it's just adding to what Kathy was saying. So there's a variety of different tools and strategies that need to be implemented. So those things are what we're trying to focus on, creating that open science framework that embraces the data that's being collected, no matter the partner, getting that information out there, hopefully in a quick and meaningful way. And then with the branding tools that Bob suggested, telling those compelling stories with the data that everyone's investing in, both publicly and maybe privately as well. So that's the vision of accelerating the science, getting us into a different place where we're managing these systems a bit more effectively than we have in the past. And hopefully you're all on board with that, and we can make meaningful progress over the next at least 5 years, and then we'll reassess and look where we need to go after that.
And I just had a quick comment, not a question, but some of you know I'm the current management board chair for the Tampa Bay Estuary program. And I think we've all been at enough of these conferences to know that we may lose some people after lunch. I hope not. But while we have a good group in the room and a good group online, I would like to personally thank Ed and his staff for holding what I think has been an outstanding conference. And I hope you all join me today. Woo-hoo!